there's going to be a little bit of what do I know in this, just because, well, obviously I wasn't around at the time. There's only so much. I'm doing this speculation in retrospect via listening to albums over the internet, and it's like, I don't know what my opinion really matters. I can only say what things come across as to me. So it isn't as though someone's opinion who was there at the time around when Simple Minds were releasing these albums from 79 to 84 or however long you were following them. It's not less, their opinion isn't less valid than mine. It's fair to say that their insight would probably even be of more merit and value than mine. It's just that I can only speculate why I, as a listener, as an observer from the 21st century, why I felt this group to be initially lesser than the groups that were getting me into this epoch of British post-punk acts. You know, Joy Division, Magazine, Susie and the Banshees, The Early Cure, Gang of Four, This Heat, The Pop Group, Swell Maps, The Sound, and even weirder stuff like Family Fodder or Milk from Cheltenham. There's so much stuff that's brilliant, and there's so many brilliant little acts that produced, you know, only a handful of albums or less than that even, and yet they were some of the most interesting sounding rock groups of all time, some of the most brazenly experimental and audacious ever put to tape. And it's funny, I put The Cure in there. The Cure are a group it took me a while to get into because, well, one, I associated them with those kind of late 80s work, which, and God forbid, early 90s work, which I still don't care for the late 80s work nearly as much as I do the early 80s work. I eventually got into the 80s work, but even for a long time I considered it lesser Joy Division, lesser Susie and the Banshees, lesser The Sound, lesser Echo and the Bunnymen, which it is. I stand by that, although I just love that epoch and aesthetic so much that inevitably I really, really got into The Cure from Free Imaginary Boys 79 up to 85's The Head on the Door. I'm not as into the top, but it is what it is. I don't dislike it, as it were. But even more so, this was the case with the group Simple Minds, whom I was aware of via a terrible song associated with a movie I really don't like, known as The Breakfast Club. You know, Don't You Forget About Me single, I Don't Need It, no one else, I don't think he needs it anymore either. Now, here's the thing, there were insistence that, before that, Simple Minds were a good band, by people, Brits, whoever were around at the time, Australians as well, I believe. I knew, or friends of mine knew, who were older than us. So eventually I did just give in and set some time aside to have with a Simple Minds album. In my case, it was the listing of New Gold Dream 81, 82, 83, 84 on the K-Punk Top 100 British Albums list, from which he published in 2004 on his blog. This is Mark Fisher, of course. If you've been following this channel for a while, you're aware of the K-Punk Mark Fisher thing and how we obsess over him over here, because I felt as though that he restored some life, excitement, and vigor to the world. I mean, I became really aware of his work in, say, early 21, and that's when I became so fastidiously dedicated to kind of continuing what I felt as though his mission seemed to me in his life, which was tragically cut short. I want to continue that, if possible, in my own way. I want to fulfill and continue to explore where I feel as though he was excavating life into this mundane void. What he reinstigated about my excitement for existence, that's what I want to pursue. And so naturally, seeing New Gold Dream on his list made me feel as though there must be something there that I hadn't considered enough before. Eventually I did get into New Gold Dream. You can view a review I published on New Gold Dream under this Cosmic Criticism label, which summarizes, I think, my feelings on that album pretty well. I've also, before that, I did A Sparkle in the Rain, which is the album released after New Gold Dream. I like both albums quite a bit. Again, you can hear my more articulated and considered specific tirades on those albums in those particular uploads. But we're just going to give a brief overview of the Simple Minds albums from 79's Life in a Day up until 84's Sparkle in the Rain. Just a brief general assessment here and now of what I feel as though is distinct and unique about each particular album, what sound it's going for, which groups it is aiming to emulate. Firstly, Life in a Day. It's what one might consider a typical post-punk album of 79, but there weren't a huge amount of post-punk albums in 79. So, if there are post-punk acts in '79 that aren't necessarily opening up new avenues of sound for other acts to explore, it's one of these acts that sounds like a group such as Magazine. I feel like Simple Minds are inspired by the artier punk groups of this particular era, of this particular scene. And if I would compare it to any group, maybe Magazine and Life in a Day, though it's pretty good, I feel as though it wasn't a major classic compared to certainly the Free Magazine albums that came out from 78 to 80. However, one story, and I've relayed this before in a previous upload of the Simple Minds albums, Cosmic Criticism. Apparently, after Life in a Day was recorded, the gang, Simple Minds, were, I think, producer John Leckie as well, were driving in a car and they popped in a cassette of this new album called Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division, and they were very enamored and impressed with it, but they were quite depressed as well because they deduced that this was the sound that they'd wanted to achieve with Life in a Day, but were unable. Well, because in real to real Cacophony, even if I hadn't heard that anecdote, I would be under the impression that they were trying to sound like Joy Division. We have a proto-industrial sound here, as much in the same way that we can consider Joy Division was. Maybe even more so. Maybe they actually heard a little bit of Throbbing Gristle. I don't know. But it's interesting to think about this as noise music and kind of European electro in the vein of what Kraftwerk and Telex were doing at this time. Interesting to think about. Or Sparks and Marauder on the Number One in Heaven album. That's blatantly disco dance, kind of synth pop oriented. We wouldn't call this synth pop. What we could call the third Simple Minds album, Empires and Dance from 1980, which is my favourite of theirs. Empires and Dance was a complete kind of Euro electronic disco sort of art pop / it's British post-punk mixed with that European synth pop sound, and it's colliding those two things into a coherent, consistent way of thinking. It's that kind of philosophic and transforming reality approach of post-punk mixed with the more danceable and kind of neurologically, kind of physiologically functional purpose of synth pop, aka what we now know as EDM. That's what synth pop's function was at that time. And then moving on to Sister Feelings Call, Suns and Fascination. These sound like post-punk art rock releases. I don't know what I would compare these to. Arty, Roxy Music kind of albums. They were produced by Steve Hillage. I suspect his influence, the first producer they were working with, who wasn't John Leckie, and I think it's fair to say John Leckie was shaping their sound over the first three albums. Producers with younger groups, I think this tends to happen, and John Leckie has proven himself such a defined and idiosyncratic producer with their own unique personality. It's easy to imagine him having done so, much in the same way Steve Lillywhite was with U2 over their first three albums. Simple Minds were eventually known as U3. We're not going to necessarily get into that for now. We probably will, but just a little bit. Steve Hillage, who's known for being the guitarist for a pro group called Khan, you may not have heard of, but then he was in Gong. You may have heard of Gong. He was also, I think, involved in the group Egg. I don't think you've heard of Egg. Egg are amazing. Steve Hillage eventually produced some solo albums, one of which was the albums Green in 78 and Rainbow Dome Music in 79 from Steve Hillage are early-ish experiments in popular British electronic music. Really interesting works. And he was to produce Simple Minds on the Suns and Fascination, Sister Feelings Call, and those are really interesting albums. What happened was they were going to release one and the other one was as a kind of a limited edition sort of affair, but I think there was such demand for the other album they ended up just putting it out anyway and selling a whole bunch of copies of it. I think they figured that, there's only so little of this other album available, they'll all sell for sure, wouldn't that be a great bit of profit and great sum of money? And it's like, well, they want more of them anyway. I guess we can just put more out and just sell more. Yeah. I mean, it was a good thought. It might not have sold as well otherwise if they just put out two albums at the same time. Who knows? There wasn't already the hype of the small sum of people who bought the small sum of the limited release album, and if everyone said, hey, that album's good, we need one more copies of it, then yeah, so be it. Good stuff. Then moving on to New Gold Dream in 82. This is the definitive new romantic album. In the 80s, this aesthetic new romantic. It's like, so they wanted to dress up and look exotic and interesting, even more than glam rock, and maybe less tacky and more like refined than glam rock was, in the early 70s. But they wanted to embrace modernism and the current technology, what the music that this was gifting to the public. They wanted to embrace the cutting edge, essentially. The new romantic was this interesting mix of an idea of a bourgeois, posh high culture and a kind of youthful modernist decadence. It's a strange thing, but somehow they had this. They seem to think it was consistent, I suppose. And New Gold Dream sonically sounds like the new romantic sound for myself to a T, which is to say, it's uber dancey but uber kind of classy and bourgeois, and has these pretensions of experiential majesty, and yet it's very base kind of shopping mall kind of teenage bubblegum music at the same time, right? And there's also pretensions of spirituality in the way that we imagine groups like U2 and the Waterboys doing so. One imagines Jim Kerr on a cliff face, looking over the ocean, just yelling his lyrics out, asking for God or something to even just tease him with an answer. And this was even more so the case with 1984 Sparkle in the Rain. Absolute big music bombast. This is their kind of stadium rock anthemic U2 release, if there ever was one. Except for the next one's a more kind of boring, kind of, adult contemporary kind of, I guess, some of the worst of all of the Sting solo albums sort of thing. But Sparkle in the Rain really did try to be lush and sleek and special, and it was produced by Steve with Lily White, and it couldn't help but, I guess, sounding more so like U2 as a result. But I think the Sparkle in the Rain release, one, I think the material is strong on it, but also, I do like the production from Lily White. What it had was, as opposed to the ethereal quality, the mysterious quality of earlier Simple Minds releases, what happened here was, I think they'd gotten too commercially successful and had profited too much of New Gold Dream. They were a bit too secure and stable, and so what happens on Sparkle in the Rain is a celebration of them, the now, and their certainty in themselves, and a kind of positive feeling, but it's all reliant on a certain material wealth and a certain monetary supplement which guarantees that optimism, and so there's something inevitably hollow and superficial lurking beneath, submerged under the sound of Sparkle in the Rain, to my ears. And then 1985's Once Upon a Time just sounds to me like some boring, bad adult contemporary nonsense. It's so bland and square. I really can't deal with it. It's just not a fun listen at all to me. It's just so painful. It just reminds me of being in like a room where everything's painted white. It's just a really ugly kind of like mental asylum white. Just not like the interior of a bank. Just like not cool, man. Not my thing. Not at all. Not even the waiting room of a bank, like the corridor of a bank that in like one of the uglier meeting rooms that they've left you in for 10 minutes. But anyway, let's get back to this group in general. So we'll cut it off, Sparkle in the Rain, and we'll keep with that. Here's the thing. I think the group, there's a recording artist that they're aiming for on each particular album, or at least a certain sound. And on each album, as from Life in a Day, we'll count the 281 albums as the same same production, so we'll call it as the name as the one in this case. Life in a Day is probably going for Magazine. Real to Cacophony is probably going for Joy Division. It's difficult to say with Empires and Dance because it is a mix between, let's say, Telex and let's just say, because it's typical, because just so we don't have to say Joy Division again and we'll just name another typical post-punk act, we'll say The Sound. And now we'll move on to the Sister Feelings Call and Sons and Fascination. Roxy Music / oh god, what would I name it as? I'm just gonna say The Police. a desire for studio excellence and kind of art rock sophistication outweighing the desire to be, punk and authentic and working class or, whatever the heck. And New Gold Dream, hey, it sounds like it could be the prototype for New Order in some places. Uh-oh. But no, it really, if it's trying to be any act, God, it could also be the prototype for an album like the Associates' Sulk, which is an amazing album. I don't know, there isn't much like the kind of really, because a lot of the synth pop prior to New Gold Dream sounds to me more like John Fox's Metamatic and Gary Newman's The Pleasure Prince were very much like that Kraftwerk futuristic aesthetic. Now it's not futuristic, now it's a retro futuristic, now it's a retro future, but the kind of robot sort of sheen 70s sci-fi set future of Kraftwerk Telex is grafted onto the early English synth pop groups, Gary Newman / the John Fox, and then more John Fox's band who left Ultravox have a more I guess the boring side of technology, the corporate side of technology. That's that very technology without it being flashy and interesting and vivid colors. It's more about the kind of chrome side of contemporary technology. That's the Vienna side of Ultravox, the kind of urban grey metropolis modernity of technology. Whereas there's a sort of perfumed, elegant kind of French Rococo club atmosphere to the technological modernity of Simple Minds' New Gold Dream, perhaps. Someone feel free to name what New Gold Dream is stealing from, because maybe in the context of 1982 it's a lot more original than I realised. Again, that's why I felt it would be easier and more insightful for a perspective would be from someone from the time, But I would say I did say it in my New Gold Dream video, there's little precedence prior to New Gold Dream for something that still stands today as like a pure pop music album, in the sense of what I knew was pop music in the 2000s, just like a shopping mall bubblegum music. Pop albums, major pop music classics prior to New Gold Dream, they all sound like a certain genre that we would call something else, I think. We would now call Pet Sounds, like the Beach Boys, we'd call that psych pop or art pop. We'd call Fleetwood Mac Rumours art pop or soft rock. We'd call, our understanding of something like Tapestry by Carole King, or even Thriller by Michael Jackson, they're understood as like post-disco in Thriller's case, or just outright disco in Off the Wall's case. Tapestry by Carole King considered him kind of singer-songwriter, that 70s kind of rustic kind of sound, analog recording, post the Let It Be recordings, kind of hippies becoming cowboys camp. But what we have with New Gold Dream is an early instance of just that. We wouldn't necessarily call it synth pop, we wouldn't necessarily call it disco or post-disco, it's just plain old pop music as we know it today. And it sounds like it's from 1982, but it's just a particular kind of dance music with an 80s sound, and it's not exploiting that sound in the sense that certain synth pop is just turning the dials up and on the gimmick, and it's like, this sound will be modern forever. Whereas there's a certain restraint and grace of the pop on New Gold Dream, which enables it to last forever sooner than some of the indulgences or the more gimmicky of the disco or synth pop one-hit wonders, if you will. Probably talked a little bit too much about New Gold Dream. Feel free to comment if I've made any errors, or feel free to watch my video on it for a more thorough summation of what I think of that particular album. And Sparkle in the Rain, trying to sound like U2 or the Waterboys, seemingly. Just a big kind of bombast stadium act which sings about spirituality, with these anthems about... And it doesn't want to be nihilistic. It's a kind of happy with the world. It just wants to get a deeper connection with God or something. And there's not an attempt to want to change reality. It's happy with reality. It just wants to get in touch with its creator. It's not trying to take things into one's own accord and become one's own gods, as an act like, the more revolutionary the post-punk acts were. Joy Division was trying to bring out a new way of thinking into this world. Groups like This Heat certainly were. The pop group, Gang of Four, they were trying to change reality as we knew it. They wanted to... There's like new ways of thinking, like they were the Situationists or something, like they were abstract thinkers. Fascinating. but instead I think the Simple Minds kind of gave this up, and they wanted to just embrace the present and embrace their commercial success. So obviously eventually New Order did as well, with the World Cup song and the funding the club and all of that. You know, New Order just came to embrace commerciality and the free market and all the rest of it. They weren't interested in changing reality. They benefited so much from the material reality that they figured there was no point anymore. And that's clearly what happened with Simple Minds as well, sad to say. I'd say I was happy for them as well, because they could flourish as artists, but they didn't flourish as artists. After Sparkling Rain, all their albums kind of suck, I think, and that's a fairly common opinion, unfortunately. It's not like they have a slew of fans and I'm the contrarian. Nope, I'm kind of the Sparkling Rain than a lot of the old school fans are, it would seem. But anyway, the subject of this particular video is, of course, Real to Real Cacophony, which I think is an extremely interesting album, a phenomenally fascinating release in the context of 1979. I cannot imagine being a listener in that particular year, hearing this, and one can only imagine what the next decade will unfold in terms of popular music. I suppose in terms of the charts, it would be mostly banal garbage, but there were interesting recordings coming out here and there if you could get a hold of them, if you're in a cool enough record store, I suppose, or if you wanted to wait it out until the 2010s or 2020s and all this stuff was available on YouTube, and especially when there was lockdowns in 2020s, gave you time to do so. Wasn't that cool? Morbidly so, I suppose. But Real to Real Cacophony, it's good stuff, and the more I think about it, the more I consider it the second most interesting of the Simple Minds albums after Empires and Dance. If you're just miffed like I was over that annoying overplayed single from that silly bad John Hughes movie, fret not. This group did have it at one point in time, even if they were just ripping off other groups and putting it into an interesting, more digestible, and I mean the sound that they were ripping off and they were working with was so fascinating. They were so with the edge, they're so at the edge of the technological frontiers at that time in the scene, and that they inevitably just made interesting music, I think. Not to mention, like, Jim Kerr's a so-so lyricist, good vocalist, I suppose. Charlie Burkle's a fantastic guitarist of that epoch. And Mick McNeil is a brilliant keyboardist. Derek Forbes is the MVP on bass. There's just actually, those three guys are so talented. It's no wonder that they worked out so well. I just think, and Jim Kerr's concepts are interesting to a point. I think there was a very interesting man reacting to modernity and the nature of experience, and whether he was fully living life as vividly and as soulfully and as kind of as fulfilled as he could. You know, he had these fantasies of what people, you know, he'd read people's books and diaries and accounts of other bands of what it's like to travel through Europe and the existentialism and all of that. And I guess he's writing about those perspective feelings, expectations, and disappointments. He's at a very interesting time in his life. And then, this is the kind of, once you make enough money or lose enough money, you think, I'm just a stupid, pretentious kid, blah, 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 blah. But when you're a stupid, pretentious kid, there's just some interesting fascinations. Like, the world seems a lot more interesting than you thought it was a bit later, you know, prior to the whole capitalist realism shit. We're not going to go there, just not in this video, actually. I mean, I inferred we might earlier, just bringing up K-Punk and Mark Fisher at the start of the video, but let's pause it for now. It's an executive decision I'm making. But anyway, I hope I have sold you on Real to Real Cacophony by Simple Minds if you were put off by them earlier. I like to think that you'll find that this group is a lot more interesting than you anticipate. If you like other groups of this particular epoch in the UK, or just around the world, there's a number of groups like this you can find in continental Europe, North America, or even in Australia to an extent. I think you'll find much to enjoy in this particular series. If you do not like music of this era, it's fair to stay the hell away. I don't think this will change your mind on. And if you've already detested Simple Minds based on what you know, I'm really unsure if this will change your mind, how you feel about this, because it depends how one feels about the British post-punk scene of that time, I suppose. It really does. But give it a chance if you're so inclined. I find it to be inevitably, probably, plausibly one of the most interesting albums to have come out in 1979, and a thoroughly fascinating listen just in general. I love playing this. It's brilliant. I want to unlock more of its secrets. Yeah, good stuff here. Thanks again, my friends, if you've suffered through this so far. Have the best possible day, night you have ever imagined or ever could possibly imagine.